The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the small farmhouse where Clara lived with her mother. The cracked screen door creaked as it swung in the breeze, and the scent of baked cornbread drifted from the kitchen. Outside, cicadas droned in the warm Texas air, but inside, Clara stood in front of a smudged mirror, holding the faded blue dress against her body. She turned from side to side, tried to smooth the sleeves where the stitching had begun to fray. The fabric, once elegant, now clung to memory of better days, but was all she had. Clara was 17, with a voice as bright and fierce as the morning sun over the plains, but none of the confidence to match it. Growing up in the small town of Wimberley, she had learned early how quickly people could judge and how little they needed to do it. In school, she was that girl, the one who always wore hand-me-downs, who ate her lunch alone, who walked home instead of catching a ride in someone else's shiny truck. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at night, just to keep the lights on. New clothes or fancy gadgets weren't just luxuries. They were impossibilities. Yet music had always been Clara's refuge. Her mother used to hum lullabies while folding laundry, and Clara would mimic her until she could carry the tune better than the radio. Over time, her voice grew richer, more confident, but stayed hidden behind bedroom doors and whisper-sung verses in the barn. No one at school really knew she could sing. They knew her as quiet, strange, and perhaps a little too proud for someone with so little. Now, as the school's annual talent show approached, Clara had done something unimaginable. She signed up to perform. It wasn't out of a desire for attention. She simply wanted, just once, to be seen for something more than a girl with threadbare clothes. She wanted to share the part of her that had never been judged, never been ridiculed. Her voice was the only thing she truly owned, and she would let it speak for her. The blue dress was her mother's idea. They had found it in a donation box behind the community church, along with a pair of scuffed white shoes. Clara had tried to protest. The dress had tiny stains near the hem, the fabric thin by time, but her mother had insisted. "It brings out your eyes," she said, brushing a lock of Clara's hair behind her ear with hands worn from scrubbing floors. "And when you sing, no one's going to notice a dress." But Clara wasn't so sure. At school, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Word had gotten out that she was going to sing, and it didn't take long for the mocking to begin. In hallways, she overheard fragments of conversations. "She's really going to get up there in that old thing? Watch her squeak like a mouse. Must be some joke." It was never said to her face, but it didn't have to be. The glances, the muffled laughter, the way people looked at her shoes, and then up at her with smirks. It said everything. The day of the show arrived with a restless sky overhead, clouds rolling in like nervous thoughts. Clara's hands trembled as she stood backstage in a high school gymnasium, clutching the hem of the blue dress. The fabric felt thin, almost like paper in her hands. Behind the curtain, she could hear the crowd gathering. Students filled the folding chairs, some texting, others laughing too loudly. Teachers lined the edges with tired smiles, and the principal tapped her clipboard impatiently. She peeked out once and regretted it immediately. A group of girls near the front row spotted her, elbowed each other, and giggled. A boy leaned in to whisper something, and they all turned in unison, eyes sweeping over her like she was an exhibit in a zoo. Clara shrank back behind the curtain, heart pounding in her ears. She pressed her palm to her chest, as if she could slow the rhythm, but it only raced faster. Her name was next on the list. One more act, and then she would have to walk into the lion's den, the gym full of students who had already decided who she was and what she was worth. She thought about running, her legs tense as if ready to bolt down the corridor, out the doors, into the night. She imagined the relief of escaping, and then the shame that would follow. Her mother would still smile, would still hug her, and say it was okay. But Clara would know. She would always know she had the chance, and let fear steal it from her. The last act ended. Applause swelled, then faded. A silence followed, brief but suffocating, as the announcer cleared his throat. "Next up," he said, his voice echoing through the speakers, "Clara Reynolds." She felt the blood drain from her face. For a moment, her legs didn't move. Then she took a breath, shallow, unsteady, and stepped forward. As she moved into the light, the curtain parted slowly, revealing the rows of faces turned toward her. The gym, once so familiar, now looked like another world. The spotlight overhead buzzed faintly. Her shoes tapped lightly against the floor. She walked to the center of the stage, the blue dress flowing around her like a soft whisper. Someone laughed, quiet, but loud enough to hear. Clara gripped the microphone with both hands. And for the briefest second, the world seemed to stop. She hadn't sung a single note, but already they were judging, already deciding. She could feel it in the air, in the stares that pinned her in place. The weight of every look, every whisper. Every time she had walked into school and felt smaller than the space she took up. It all crashed down in that moment. Her throat tightened. But then she heard it, not from the crowd, but from somewhere deeper. A memory, a voice warm and steady, saying, "Your voice is the one thing they can't take from you." She closed her eyes. And when she opened them again, she was no longer standing in front of them. She was in the barn, singing to the wind. She was in the kitchen, humming with her mother. She was nowhere and everywhere. Just Clara, not the girl with the second-hand dress, not the joke they whispered about, but the one who had something to say. She opened her mouth to sing. The first note had barely left her lips when a hush swept through the gymnasium, as if someone had reached out and turned the world's volume down. Clara didn't notice the silence at first. She was too focused on breathing evenly, too focused on keeping her voice from quivering. But then she felt it. The shift, like the moment before a storm when the wind stops and the air holds its breath. The mocking eyes were still there, the skeptical expressions frozen mid-scoff. But their voices had vanished. They were listening, really listening, and it terrified her more than their laughter ever had. Her hands clutched the microphone tightly. She couldn't let herself think too much. Not about the crowd, not about the cheap dress, not about the whispers that still hung somewhere in the back of the room. She had to hold on to something real, something that wouldn't falter under the weight of doubt. So she reached inward to the voice she had carried since childhood. The one her mother had nurtured through long nights and tired mornings. The one she had protected from the world because she was afraid of what the world might do to it. She sang. The words flowed, carried not just by melody but by conviction. Her voice trembled at first, uncertain and timid, but then it found its rhythm. The song she had chosen wasn't famous, wasn't flashy. It was a folk tune her mother used to sing while hanging laundry in the backyard, soft and steady, full of old truths and quiet strength. It was a song about longing, about finding one's place, about hope that flickered but never went out. And as she sang, Clara imagined her mother sitting at the edge of the crowd, though she knew she couldn't be there. Her shift at the diner would not end until late that night. She imagined the warmth of her mother's hand in hers, the calm in her voice when she said, "If you ever get scared, just sing louder. Let the fear hear you." So Clara did. Her voice rose, stronger, clearer. The nerves were still there, but they were shrinking, dissolving under the force of something more powerful. Every note she hit seemed to stretch a little further into the audience, dismantling assumptions, cutting to the masks worn by classmates and teachers alike. She didn't dare look anyone in the eye. Not yet. She was still fragile, still standing on the thin edge between fear and courage. But inside, something had shifted. When the final note rang out, she stood in silence, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the applause, soft at first, like rain on a tin roof, and then louder, swelling with each passing second. Someone stood up, then another. Hands clapped, feet stomped, voices called her name. It was more than just a polite response. It was real, tangible, the kind of approval she had never dared to imagine, much less expect. Yet it felt foreign, almost too large to belong to her. She stood there, stunned, unable to move, her hand still clutching the microphone as though it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. When she finally stepped off the stage, her knees were shaking. The curtain closed behind her, muffling the continued applause. The backstage area, dim and cramped, was suddenly too small to contain what she felt. A rush of adrenaline surged through her, but along with it came something else. Panic. Not fear of failure anymore, but of what came next. She had exposed something raw, something sacred. And now everyone had seen it. There was no going back to the shadows. She barely noticed the other performers as they passed her, offering quiet nods or brief, startled glances. She kept her eyes down, her breathing uneven. Then she heard footsteps, quick, purposeful, and turned just in time to see Olivia approaching. Olivia was everything Clara wasn't. Popular, confident, effortlessly beautiful. She had been the expected favor of the night, the one everyone assumed would win. Her performance earlier had been polished, dramatic, and accompanied by a pre-recorded track. She had received generous applause, but nothing like what Clara had just experienced. Now she stood before Clara, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "That was unexpected," she said, voice carefully measured. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Clara blinked. She didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked her that before. Singing had always been something she did alone, something she never thought required permission or explanation. "I just sing," she said finally, her voice still soft from performance. Olivia nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Well, you surprise a lot of people out there." There was no malice in her tone, but Clara couldn't read her expression. Was it admiration? Resentment? Curiosity? She didn't know, and she didn't have the energy to find out. So she offered a quiet thank you and turned away, retreating into the corner of the backstage area, where she could be alone for a moment. She sank onto an old folding chair, the metal cold to the thin fabric of her dress. Her hands trembled in her lap. It wasn't the same trembling as before. It was a tremble of something awakening, something that had been dormant for too long. A belief, maybe a beginning. Someone handed her a bottle of water. She didn't even look up to see who it was. She just nodded in thanks and held it between her palms, grounding herself in the coolness of it. The noise from the auditorium swelled and faded as the next performer took the stage. Life moved on, as it always did. But something had changed, not just out there in the way people saw her, but inside. The fear hadn't vanished. It still curled in her stomach like smoke, but it no longer had control over her. Later, as the show drew to a close and the principal prepared to announce the results, Clara stood in the wings, watching from behind the curtain. She could hear her name being whispered again, but this time the tone was different. Curious, respectful, even. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't being mocked. She was being seen, and that frightened her in a way she hadn't expected. Visibility came with weight, with responsibility, with expectation. Clara wasn't sure she was ready for any of it, but then she thought of her mother again, working a double shift without complaint, believing in her without question. And she thought of the voice inside her, the one that had carried her through the most terrifying moment of her life. She wasn't ready, maybe, but she was here, and that had to be enough. For now. The auditorium lights dimmed again as the final performer bowed and exited the stage, signaling the end of the night. Backstage, Clara stood against the wall, the hem of her dress brushing her ankles as she shifted nervously from foot to foot. Her name still echoed in the quiet spaces between conversations, not whispered in mockery anymore, but spoken with a mix of awe and disbelief. For a girl used to fading into corners, the sudden attention felt disorienting, like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. She had no script for this part of the evening. Singing had been hard, but at least it was familiar. This, however, this moment of waiting and wondering, felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, uncertain whether she had just flown or merely fallen, and hadn't hit the ground yet. Her hands, still clammy, clutched the water bottle someone had given her earlier. It had grown warm in her grasp. Forgotten as thoughts spiraled through her mind. She kept her eyes lowered, avoiding the glances of those passing by. She knew many of them had been among the ones laughing earlier, and now they didn't quite know how to look at her. That uncertainty in their eyes mirrored her own. She had stood on that stage and become someone else, or maybe, finally, become who she truly was. But that didn't make it easier to stand here and face what came next. Then, without warning, the curtain lifted slightly at the side, and a voice called her name. Not the announcer's voice, but one of the backstage assistants, a junior named Elliot she barely knew. His face was flushed, his eyes wide. "Clara," he said, almost breathless. "You need to come with me. The principal wants all the finalists on stage." She hesitated, her heart skipping. Finalists. The word landed heavily in her chest. Not because she had expected to win, but because a part of her had never even considered she might be chosen at all. It had always been enough just to be heard. Anything beyond that felt foreign, like a prize from a world that had never belonged to her. Still, she followed Ellie out to stage, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The noise from the audience hummed like static in her ears as she stepped under the harsh overhead lights once more. There were 4 other students already lined up. Olivia, of course, along with 2 boys from the senior class, and a younger girl who had performed a dance number. They all stood straight and smiling, rehearsed and polished. Clara, by contrast, looked as if she had wandered into the wrong place entirely. Her dress still hung unevenly at the sleeves, and her shoes scuffed softly on the floor as she took her place at the end of the row. The principal stepped forward with a clipboard in hand, and a microphone clipped to her blouse. Her voice rang out clearly across the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her tone formal but warm. "We've witnessed a range of incredible talent, and I want to acknowledge the bravery it takes to get up on this stage." Clara's stomach turned as the speech continued. Applause erupted at every mention of a name or performance. And then, as if time folded on itself, she heard it again, her name, this time spoken not in jest or surprise, but with weight. "And now," the principal said, pausing for effect, "I am proud to announce that the winner of this year's Wimberley High Talent Showcase is Clara Reynolds." For a moment, Clara didn't move, didn't breathe. The auditorium seemed to pause with her. Then a swell of applause broke over her like a wave, filling every corner of the room. The other finalists turned their heads in her direction, and Olivia's clapping faltered ever so slightly, just enough for Clara to notice. But she didn't linger on that. She couldn't. Her heart beat so loudly it drowned everything else out. Someone, maybe Elliot again, guided her forward, placing a small plaque into her trembling hands. It was lightweight, made of cheap acrylic, but it might as well have been carved from marble. The words engraved on it shimmered under the lights. First place, vocal performance, Clara Reynolds. She stared at it, numb and overwhelmed, as cameras flashed and cheers rang out. In that instant, she wasn't the girl with the worn-out dress anymore. She was a girl who had stunned an entire auditorium into silence, and then into thunderous applause. After the ceremony ended, people began to crowd the stage. Teachers approached to shake her hand. Parents from the audience offered praise, and even a few students, ones who had never spoken to her before, asked if she gave singing lessons or had plans to audition for bigger competitions. It felt surreal, as though she had stepped into someone else's life. A life where people didn't look through her or past her, but directly at her. Clara's voice remained mostly silent through it all. She smiled when she could, nodded politely, said thank you more times than she could count. But inside, she was somewhere else entirely, still standing at the microphone, still hearing her mother's voice in her mind, reminding her that no one could ever take away what was hers. Eventually, the gymnasium began to empty. Students spilled out into the parking lot, their voices echoing in the night air. Clara slipped away from the last of the well-wishers and stepped outside, the cool breeze hitting her skin like a blessing. She clutched the plaque against her chest, her fingers tracing the letters again and again, as if afraid they might disappear. The night was quiet now, the stars bright above the dark Texas sky. She looked up at them, the weight of the evening finally beginning to settle in. It wasn't about winning. Not really. It was about standing there in front of all of them and refusing to be ashamed. It was about claiming a piece of herself she had hidden for too long. Behind her, the gym doors creaked open and Olivia stepped out, heels clicking softly against the pavement. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, arms crossed, eyes on Clara. "You were good," she said finally, her voice neutral. Clara turned, her expression calm. "Thank you." Olivia hesitated, then added, "Better than I expected." It wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't a threat either. It was something in between. Clara nodded once, accepting it for what it was, and watched as Olivia walked away, disappearing into the night with the others. Alone again, Clara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like an unseen chorus. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to hide. She didn't feel less than anyone else. She didn't feel like the girl in a second-hand dress. She felt like herself. The next morning began like any other. The alarm on the old digital clock blinked erratically before buzzing to life at 6 o'clock, dragging Clara out of a restless sleep. Her room, modest and sparsely decorated, was bathed in soft golden light that filtered through the floral curtain above her window. Outside, the world stirred with routine. The hum of tractors from neighboring farms, birds chirping in the oaks, the distant clang of her mother moving about in the kitchen. But within Clara, something had changed, a quiet tension like the first taut pull of a string before a song begins. She rolled out of bed and stared at the plaque on her nightstand. It looked oddly out of place, too polished among the chipped wood, dog-eared books, and folded laundry. She reached out and ran a finger along the engraved letters again. There was still a part of her that struggled to believe it had all actually happened. Winning had never been the goal. Being heard had been. And yet, that moment, the thunderous applause, the spotlight, the principal's voice calling her name, had done more than prove she could sing. It had shifted something in the way people looked at her that, more than anything, felt like the real prize. Downstairs, her mother greeted her with a tired smile and a plate of toast. She had come home late the night before, her apron still dusted with flour, her hands red from washing dishes. Clara had waited up, eager to tell her everything, but the words had tangled in her throat. How could she explain what it felt like to be seen after years of being invisible? Instead, she had simply handed her mother the plaque, and they had sat in silence, her mother's eyes glistening with unspoken pride. Now, as they ate in the quiet kitchen, her mother finally broke the silence. "I heard Mrs. Danvers told everyone at the diner that you sounded like a professional," she said, voice light, but laced with meaning. Clara smiled, a small, private thing. "She was there," said she cried. And you know how she never cries about anything but soap operas. Her mother laughed softly, then reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Clara's. "You did good, baby. I know it wasn't easy." Clara nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. It didn't feel real, not until I heard them clapping. Her mother squeezed her hand. Sometimes the world just needs a little reminder of what it's missing. At school, everything felt different. The same hallway stretched before her, the same lockers slammed shut with the same familiar clang. But the way people moved around her had shifted. No longer was she the girl to ignore, to dismiss. People looked her in the eye. They smiled. Some offered nods of recognition, while others, like Olivia, kept their distance but no longer with disdain. There was uncertainty now, a tentative respect that Clara didn't quite know how to receive. In English class, her teacher paused during roll call to congratulate her. "Your performance was moving, Clara," she said, resting a hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. "Truly memorable." Clara murmured a thank you and stared down at her notebook, her cheeks burning. She wasn't used to this version of attention, not the mocking glances of the past, but something closer to admiration. It made her feel exposed in a new way, as if everyone could see the vulnerability she had poured into her performance. Between classes, people approached her, some with genuine curiosity, others with thinly veiled envy. "Hey," one girl said by the lockers, fiddling with the straps of her backpack. "You've got a serious voice. You thinking about doing more shows? Like for real?" Clara hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." "You should. Seriously. My cousin works with a music coach in Austin. I could ask her if—" "It's okay," Clara cut in gently. "Thanks, though." The attention was flattering, yes, but it wasn't what she wanted. At least, not yet. The stage had given her a voice, but she wasn't ready to turn it into something larger than herself. Not while the applause still echoed in her memory and the emotions of that night were still settling in her chest. By lunchtime, she found herself retreating to her usual spot under the large oak tree behind the school building. It was quieter there, away from the murmurs and sideways glances. She sat with her lunchbox unopened beside her, staring at the sky, unsure of what was supposed to happen next. Winning had brought clarity, but it had also awakened expectations she wasn't prepared to fulfill. It wasn't just about one performance anymore. People now assumed things about her, things she wasn't certain she could live up to. Footsteps crunched over the grass, and Clara looked up to see someone approaching. It was Jonah, a boy from her literature class. Quiet, polite, always with a book in hand. He had never said much to her before. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She nodded, surprised, and he dropped down beside her, setting his backpack down with a thud. "I just want to say what you did last night was incredible," he said after a pause. "Not just your voice, but the way you stood there, like you weren't afraid." Clara blinked. "I was terrified." He chuckled. "Well, you fooled us." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. "I've always liked writing," Jonah said quietly, "but I've never shared any of it. Not really. Hearing you last night made me wonder if maybe it's worth it, even if it's scary." Clara turned to look at him. There was something in his eyes she recognized, something familiar, that aching need to be heard, to be more than what people saw on the surface. "You should," she said. "If it means something to you, it's worth sharing." He nodded, thoughtful. Then, as the bell rang in the distance, he stood up and offered her a hand. "Thanks, Clara." She took it, steady now, and smiled. That night, alone in her room, she opened her journal and began to write. Not a song, not yet, just words, fragments of feeling, memories stitched into paragraphs. She didn't know what it would become, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was no longer writing to silence. Somewhere out there, people were listening. And even if the noise faded in time, she had already proven something to herself, that her voice, no matter how fragile, had the power to reach others. By the end of the week, Clara's performance was no longer just a moment whispered about in school hallways. It had become something far bigger, something she had never anticipated. The video of her singing, captured on an old phone by a classmate, had found its way onto social media. At first, it had only a few likes and comments from students who had been there that night. But then, quietly, it began to travel, shared by one student to another, then reposted by a local community page, and eventually picked up by a regional arts blog that praised the raw emotion of a young girl whose voice transcended the circumstances around her. Clara only discovered the video's traction when she opened her phone one morning and found her notifications overflowing. Dozens of messages had piled up overnight, some from classmates, some from strangers. She scrolled through them, eyes wide, reading messages that came from other towns, other states, and eventually other countries. People wrote to say they were moved, that her voice had reminded them of someone they loved, that they hadn't expected to cry at a high school talent show video. One woman said she hadn't sung in years, but was inspired to return to music. Another admitted she'd been too afraid to ever perform in public and now wanted to try. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her phone in her hands, overwhelmed. The weight of their words settled on her shoulders, not like a burden, but like a responsibility she hadn't known she was carrying. It was one thing to sing for a gym full of people who had known her as that quiet girl. It was another thing entirely to become, in the eyes of complete strangers, a symbol of something larger, resilience, courage, authenticity. She hadn't meant for any of that. She had only wanted to sing. But now that it was out there, she couldn't take it back. The story had taken on a life of its own. At school, things continued to evolve. Teachers invited her to sing at upcoming events. A counselor from the district emailed her an invitation to a youth art summit. The local newspaper requested an interview. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Some congratulated her with genuine warmth, others with a hint of envy. Olivia, once the untouchable queen of school performances, now walked past Clara with a clipped nod instead of a smug smile. The shift in social dynamics was subtle but unmistakable. One afternoon, as she sat alone at the same oak tree behind the school, trying to collect her thoughts, the principal approached her. It was unusual to see her outside the building, let alone seeking Clara out. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, and Clara moved over to make room on the bench. "I've been getting calls," the principal said after a pause, "from people asking about you. Talent agencies, small labels, even a couple of local studios. They want to know what your plans are." Clara's heart skipped. I don't have any plans. Not yet." "That's okay," the principal replied. "You don't have to figure it all out now. But I think it's important you know what you did, it meant something to people, not just here. And sometimes when something like this happens, it opens doors you didn't even know existed. You don't have to walk through them, but you should at least look." The conversation left Clara quiet for hours afterward. She didn't want fame. She didn't want to chase approval or reinvent herself to fit into someone else's idea of talent. But she did want to sing. She wanted to create. And if that meant opening herself up to new possibilities, scary as they were, maybe she owed it to herself to consider them. At home, her mother noticed a change. Clara had always been quiet, thoughtful, but now there was a different kind of stillness in her, a contemplative calm mixed with something close to resolve. "You're not sleeping much," her mother said one evening as she folded laundry at the table. Clara looked up from her notebook. "Just thinking." "About the attention?" Clara nodded. "I didn't ask for it." "No," her mother agreed, "but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." They sat in silence a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. Then her mother added, "You've worked harder than anyone sees. You didn't get lucky. You got brave, and that matters." Later that week, Clara was invited to perform at a nearby community center event, an evening of local talent benefiting a small-town arts fund. She debated whether to accept. It was a small venue, but it was the first time she would sing outside the safety of her school. The stakes felt higher. She would be a featured guest, not just another student on a roster. People would come specifically to hear her. The night of performance, she stood behind the modest curtain of the community center stage, staring at the small crowd gathering in folding chairs. It was nothing like the gymnasium. There were no glittering lights or roaring applause yet. Just people, older couples, families, a few teenagers, faces expectant and kind. Her name was announced with warm applause, and as she stepped onto the stage, she caught a glimpse of her mother in the second row, sitting straight, her face calm but proud. Clara adjusted the mic, cleared her throat, and let the silence stretch just long enough to steady her nerves. Then she began to sing. This time, the song was hers, lyrics she had written over the past few days, inspired by the chaos and clarity of the last week. It spoke of finding voice in unexpected places, of wearing bruises like badges, of learning to bloom in soil others had deemed barren. It was raw, imperfect, but utterly her. When the final note faded, there was a stillness and an applause, gentler than the roaring noise of a talent show, but deeper, more real. Afterward, people approached her not as admirers but as fellow storytellers. An elderly man who played harmonica shared how he once performed for his wife on their anniversary. A teenage girl confessed she wrote poetry, but had never read it aloud. Clara listened to each of them, feeling less like a girl at the center of something, and more like a part of something, connected by the quiet thread of shared expression. In the weeks that followed, Clara continued to sing, not for acclaim, not for numbers, but because she finally understood the purpose of her voice. It wasn't just about being heard. It was about reaching others, lifting something in them they didn't know needed lifting. She still wore her second-hand dresses. She still walked to school and helped her mother with groceries. But now, she carried herself differently, not with arrogance, but with certainty. She knew what she was capable of. She knew what mattered, and she no longer flinched under the weight of stares. Because the girl they once saw as forgettable had found a way to be unforgettable without changing who she was, but by finally allowing the world to see her as she had always been.